And we are live. Okay. So today is a special day because it is SASA's 3rd birthday. So we want to wish SASA a very happy birthday. And we are here with Dr. Stephani Sellover, and she will be discussing ancient Middle Eastern warfare in the archaeological record. But before we go ahead and get started, I would like to go over SASA, what we're about, kind of give us just a little intro of who we are. So today is the first day of our birthday bash, and we're celebrating with a masterclass. All right, so what is SASA? SASA is the Save Ancient Studies Alliance, and our mission is to reverse the current downward trend in the study of the ancient world by engaging the public and bringing together students and scholars to share their passion for the study of the ancient world in order to inspire a vast new generation of students. So where can you find us? We're pretty much on all social media platforms: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, Twitch, TikTok, and LinkedIn, and we regularly post every day. And before we get started, we'll just go over the protocol real quick. So we always want to remember to be kind and be respectful and listen and ask thoughtful questions throughout the event. We will be saving about 15 minutes at the end of this masterclass for a Q&A session. And remember, please be patient with us using the technology because we're administering it. And sometimes we do have a little bit of technical difficulties, but please bear with us. SASA live events are streamed on Twitch, YouTube, and Facebook, and all of the live events are recorded and archived. And we do post the archives from time to time, and we want to remind you to please have fun. So happy 3rd birthday, SASA. All right. And then also, real quick, we wanted to remind all of our followers that every $25 you donate to SASA will enter you into a raffle, and you'll be entered. Your name will be entered into a drawing to win a meet and greet with Dr. Kara Cooney, who is a very famous Egyptologist. And the meet and greet will allow you to discuss pretty much any of her books, and you can also invite up to 10 friends. So if you enjoy some of the content that we put out, please consider becoming a recurring donor. So if you enjoy our Archeo gaming live streams, our book clubs, our reading groups, please consider being a supporter with a recurring monthly donation. And for as little as $3 a month, you can help us save ancient studies. And remember, if you would like to do this, go to saveancientstudies.org/birthdaybash to learn more. All right, and thank you for joining us today. I will go ahead and turn the time over to Dr. Sellover, and she can take the reins on this. So, all right. Turn this off.
All right. Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. So, as I said, my name is Dr. Stephani Sellover. I'm coming to you from somewhat sunny, for once, Seattle, Washington, at the University of Washington. I am in the Department of Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures. A little bit about myself for half a second. I'm an archaeologist who works primarily on the ancient Middle East. And my big areas of study are in the studies of ancient human remains or bioarchaeology, as well as ancient metallurgy. And my biggest research project to date so far has been on the archaeology of warfare, particularly warfare in pre-urban or early urban societies of Turkey, also called Anatolia. And I'm currently working on have a book that is hopefully in press in the relatively near future and coming out in the next year, inshallah, as we say in the Middle East. And so today I'll be talking to you about how we can understand warfare in the archaeological record. And let's see if I can people see my presentation? Let me make sure this, oh, there we go. Okay, good. Everyone, I hope we can see this okay. If not, please let me know. As I said, this is kind of my area of research. And let's talk a little bit about how we understand and study these materials. If you have any questions, just please let me know. Just also let you know that there'll be some depictions in the course of this talk of photographs of human skeletal remains. I know this is an ethical issue and one which people perhaps are uncomfortable I will give a little bit of a warning before I show any of them, but just to let you know, there will be some pictures as I discuss the ways that we can look at violence in the archaeological record through human skeletal remains themselves. So I think my first question for everybody, that's a little slower than, oh, there we go. Just kind of a starting point is, what is war? This is perhaps a more difficult question than one might think it is. We think we all know what war is, and we have a lot of ideas in our head when we think about war. And you can close your eyes and think of the ways that we have, so concepts of things like tanks, people in matching uniforms, perhaps marching across a battlefield of some way, maybe ideas of 20th century warfare of things like trench warfare, guns, and various types of weapons. And of course, that is a certain idea of warfare. When it comes to ancient war, it's a little bit more difficult because there's all these definitions of what is and what is not considered to be war. So, what is just violence? And what is what we call maybe interpersonal violence, and what is full scale war. And this is something I kind of think about a lot when it comes to ancient warfare. Is there a certain number of people have to be involved, certain length of time that has to be involved, certain kinds of weapons? There's a lot of disagreement and argument within the archaeological and anthropological community about what is and is not considered to be warfare. This is one of the things we do. So, in order to start answering these questions, I also start to think about the ways in which the reasons we fight. I personally believe that humans are not at their core horrible creatures. I really have to believe that as someone who studies war a lot and gives a lot of thought to it. And I think as a whole, people generally are more at peace than they are at war. We are not no civilization's ever been constantly at war. It doesn't really work that way. It's too exhausting. It's not really within us. At the same time, I also fervently also believe there's never been a totally peaceful civilization either. So humans have some sort of levels of peace and war within society at all times. So my research in particular really looks at the ways in which warfare is codified within society. So as we set up societies, as we kind of come together, live in communities, and learn to live with each other, we also codify violence and make violence ingrained in our very society in various ways. So why do we fight? There's lots of reasons for this, of course. So things as simple of as increasing access to fixed resources. This is, I think, the most common reason people think of is people. Somebody else over there has something we might want. It might be luxury goods. It might be food. It might be children and women. There's all kinds of reasons people might want things that they don't have enough of. To capture movable valuables, to try to contain new materials. Another one also might be to just capture another group of people. So you have an independent group and you don't just want their stuff, you want them, you want their manpower, you want their land, you want them to be working for you. Is a kind of a common reason for it. So conquering and incorporating another group altogether. And also to try to force them perhaps to make decisions in your favor. So maybe you don't want to completely conquer them, but put them up as a puppet government. So they do the things that you want them to do. And also sometimes it's just you think someone else might attack you. So a group thing is in fear of somebody else, so they attack first. There's lots of, this is not a complete list, of course. There's also other ideological reasons, religious reasons. There's just so many reasons why people fight, but this kind of gives you an opening idea. We often talk about the reasons for fighting within the art within history altogether. So when I study archaeology of war, it's quite different than doing the history of war. So when we do histories, we often looked primarily at textual references. So seeing what people have written about war. From that, we can get ideas of who started it, why did it happen, who was fighting on each side, how many people were fighting, what were the tactics involved, and finally things like who won. And this is pretty straightforward too. I think everybody here has read accounts of war. There's lots of TV shows about it. So many books about this. You learn about this in school from the ages of 6 years old and onwards. But when it comes to the archaeology of war, it's not quite so simple or so easy, because often if we have especially non-literate societies or pre-literate societies or societies who just didn't leave a lot of records, and we know that the warfare happened, how can we understand these same kinds of questions we ask of history? Often we can't understand exactly how it started, why it started, who was fighting, even things like who won. These are questions that are incredibly difficult to answer from the archaeological record. because all we have are these material remains that might show that violence happened over a period of time and that maybe something bad happened in this area, but it's not going to tell us who, what, where, when, why kinds of questions we often ask history. So when I look at the archaeology of war, what I look at instead are what I call proxies, or things that show us that are our evidence that war happened. So my primary evidence I look at this are things such as the bioarchaeological remains, or just a fancy way of saying the human remains. So any kind of skeletal remains that might have evidence of violence upon them. Looking at weapons technologies. When do weapons show? What kind of weapons are there? When do they show up? What kind of numbers do we have? And also, who is wielding them? Do you have a sense of, is it mostly men? Are there women involved? Or children involved? Or elderly? So who's using weapons as well as what kind of weapons exist? Fortifications, which in this case means the ways that settlements are ready for war. Do they build large walls? Are they building buildings with very, very thick walls? Are they building moats? Are they building glacis, also known as ramparts, kind of slope things that go up to walls? How are how are cultures building their cities around the threat of violence? Destruction layers. So if something does happen, can we see that a city was put to fire? Was it destroyed? And if so, like what parts? Was it just the castle? Was it just the palace? Was it just the temples? Was it the entire area? And also the problem is not all destructions related to war. We recently had a series and ongoing number of incredibly destructive earthquakes in the southeastern area of Turkey, which has been just astronomically and horrifically um, just tragic in every single way. And the entire area of Turkey has a big history with earthquakes. So sometimes when you find destruction levels, it's not a sign of war. It might be a sign of natural causes like earthquakes or floods. So these things can also happen. Also, the actual remnants really behind of how we see war. So iconography or depictions, cultural drawings and ways of warriors, of kings, of conquest. So those kind of things. And finally, with a number of asterisks, actual battlefields, which I think is the least likely of all these. And I'll come back to that. I'm going to go through these one by one. So to understand this, I have a couple questions about violence and prehistory. So I'm not looking at the warfare of the Roman Empire. We know a lot about that from all kinds of different historians. And of course, there is archaeology of Roman warfare as well. When I look at this, I'm looking at very early. So what my questions about violence in this earliest time periods are, what purpose does organized violence play in society? Violence has a place in society, whether we like that or not. It is true. When did violence become a codified aspect of human culture? When did we really incorporate violence? And finally, if we can get a sense of who is fighting in particular within society. So I also want to just define two different terms real fast before I move on to my actual case study. The idea of warfare versus interpersonal violence. Interpersonal violence is, again, an overly big way of saying people just kind of fighting each other. If you go to a bar, for example, and get into a bar fight with somebody, that is interpersonal violence. It's going to be one-on-one. It could be even groups, people who are fighting each other, but it's kind of smaller scale. Warfare is generally between two larger cultural groups. That can be a civil war. It can be between different villages. It can be different countries. But it tends to be a larger than interpersonal. Interpersonal, like you can see by the idea, between certain smaller groups. But it's hard to find an exact line when something goes from interpersonal to full out warfare, especially with early societies. We're not talking about very large numbers of peoples. So I'm going to talk about this a little bit more later on, but it's not always that easy to tell the difference between these two things. So there is a large amount of literature out there in archaeology as well as in anthropology. I'm not the only person by any means discussing warfare. So there's a lot of ways we can study this. There is things, like I said, like textual evidence, archaeological evidence. And there's also a kind of concept of scale. So there, I have a picture of a book here next to me on my screen here by Lawrence Keeley, War Before Civilization, The Myth of the Peaceful Savage. This is not a great title, and I do not really espound this particular use of wording. This book was written in 1996. Why I bring it up at all is it's one of the foundational texts for as kind of with the end of the 20th century, the emergence of archaeology and anthropology of warfare. It begins a lot of conversations. I don't necessarily agree with everything Keeley has to say, but it's a very important book in a lot of ways. It talks about the ways we can study warfare in the archaeological record, and especially in early pre-literate or low literate societies, and looking particularly at things at how war is organized, how war is justified, and also the fact that war has to be at a certain time period. Like I said, war is not forever. It's limited in time and scope, and it always has to be. So if you want to know more about this, the Keeley book is a good place to start. It's very readable, but it's also very, very dated, despite coming from 1996, which is a while ago now. But I think some of the terms used, like the word savage, is a word that I think we need to really kind of get rid of entirely from vocabulary, especially when it comes to archaeology. I really want to put that out there. It's an important book, but the language is very, very dated. All right. So when I look at war, I'm particularly looking at the ways warfare and the rise of urbanism are intertwined. What I'm not claiming is that warfare is only possible with an urbanized society. I actually don't think that's necessarily true. For example, there are various nomadic groups who are very much able to be at war with each other. We know this to be true, but it's harder to study the archaeology of nomadic groups because they tend to leave a lot less archaeological material behind. So what I'm studying then in the archaeological record is how the rise of urbanized societies, the ways that people go from more simple, egalitarian, farming agrarian villages to more complex, walled off like settlements that will include things like systemic inequality, a rise of things like temple architecture, palatial architecture, and a society in which people are living with a large amount of class-based systems. So that's kind of an idea of urbanism. And the way that when urbanism starts to become a larger concept, the way it uses war or violence and the threat of violence to increase that urbanized power. So looking then at broad trends, I don't look at singular sites for everything. So I actually look at a very large data set to see the ways in which war is brought into society across a large area, and the way people are using violence and preparedness and being scared of violence to create urbanized power, the rise of elites as well. So my particular case study comes out of this region. You can see on my picture here of Anatolia, also known as Turkey, which has recently changed its name in English to Turkiye, which is actually the correct word for it now. I'm still getting used to that, so I have a tendency to still call it Turkey, but it's in fact Turkiye now. My apologies. So this is an area that kind of can see this big region. Within the ancient Middle East, it's often called the land bridge between East and West. I don't really love that designation, but it's an area that kind of bridges different regions. It's a major area of trade for all times, and so I think it's a great way to understand early urbanism because it's a place that both has its own very distinct ancient cultures, as well as being a place where lots of trade and other groups have always come through. So within this area, I look at two very distinct regions, what I'm calling central and southeastern Anatolia. But I'm not claiming by any means that either of these locations are like anything like empires or single cultures or even have a lot to do with each other. And when I'm talking in this ancient time period I'm discussing, what you have here instead is a large number of cities that have their own lands around them, but they have some cultural continuity between them, but also great differences. But why I include these as specific regions is because they have more in common with each other than the outside areas. So within the central Anatolian region, you can see in the kind of green color here in this picture, is an area in which there are large mountains to the north and the south. It's an area that tends to be a little more isolated in these earlier time periods. There is some outside trade, but there aren't many people coming into this region. So it's kind of coming into its own as it is increasing into urbanism without a lot of outside influence. On the other end, you see southeastern Anatolia in the kind of more bluish color on the bottom there. It looks kind of funny for some reason right now. And that region is considered to be the northern point of Mesopotamian region. So while it's not Mesopotamia, it is its own distinct area with its own distinct culture. There's a lot of connections with Mesopotamian cultures and peoples and trade. So you can kind of get a sense of one area that's more socially isolated, one area that is a larger part of the Middle Eastern world. And that's why I chose these two regions. Within this is my actual data set. Excuse me. I'm looking at a total of 81 different sites, which is a very large number of sites. So looking across these broad trends, 39 from Central Anatolia, 42 from the Southeast, and then looking at 3 different very large time periods. I'll go through these more in a second. Looking primarily at published data, as long as a small amount of unpublished data. I show a picture of one of my mentors, Dr. Yilmaz Erdal of Hacettepe University. He helped me find this project originally when I started working on it, and has also really helped me with the bioarchaeological aspect that I work with. So what do I do with this? So here's a nice map of most, but not all, of those 81 sites. I tried to do a map with all 81, and it was just an absolute mess to look at. These are the sites that I talk about the most. Just give you kind of set up. I'm not expecting anyone to really remember what all this is, but just give you a sense of how this all looks. Quite a large number of sites. So 3 different time periods I'm working with. Starting with the early to middle Chalcolithic time period, 5000 to 3800 BCE, a very long period of time. I start here because it's in some ways, it's one of the least studied time periods from all of Turkey. There aren't many sites that date to this time period, to be quite honest, and it's not that well studied altogether. What you have in this time period are both nomadic groups as well as the beginnings of settled agricultural societies with very little long distance trade in either of the regions I'm talking about. So why I start here is it's kind of the origins of agricultural society and the origins of urbanism, the first kind of early versions of it. The next time period I look at is the late Chalcolithic, what's called early Bronze 1. So just straight up numbers, 3800 to 3200 BCE. This is an interesting time period because it's the transition to higher urbanism and a transition to larger settlements. You start to get a huge number of archaeological sites being founded for the first time. You get some of the earliest big public architecture and communal projects like that, as well as the origins of bronze metallurgy. Mesopotamia, you get the earliest writing. They're not here in Turkey, where we do not get it for quite a long time afterwards. You start to get the earliest fortification systems and a strong idea of the emergence of elites, of people who are ruling over other people. So this kind of idea of the earlier, more egalitarian times, this middle period, we start to get more and more emergence of elite society. And then finally, the end of the early Bronze Age. So this is actually the wrong slide, and I apologize for that. This should say early Bronze 2 and 3 from about 3200 to about 2000 BCE. My sincere apologies. And this is a time period which you get by the end of this, nearly all of societies are in these large settlements. You get fortification systems. Nomads most definitely still exist, but they're much harder to find in the archaeological record. You get all kinds of large monumental architecture and the small appearance of actual state society and elite culture altogether. So you can see my 3 different areas. What I look at is what kind of evidence of these proxies of violence do you see in the archaeological record? What does this tell us about the place of war in society? So starting with human skeletal remains. So when I study evidence of violence in the archaeological record through humans, through our remains of humans, looking particularly at things such as locations and patterns of violence upon the body, as well as where you find the bodies. Are they in cemeteries? Are they on battlefields? Are they in settlements? So how are the dead being buried? What kinds of injuries are being found in terms of time periods, and who is being injured? Is it across the entire population? Is it things like, is it mostly men? Is it mostly people who are in their 20s and 30s? Who is being hurt when you see violence in these bodies altogether? So one of the important things to look at when it comes to patterns of violence is to understand that there are certain kinds of patterns you see in violence that you might not see in things like, for example, everyone here, I imagine, at some point has probably at least gotten hurt by falling down. You fall down some stairs, you trip over your feet, whatever it is, and maybe some of you have broken bones. That is not violence. That's just being clumsy. You can also get hurt by, say, maybe a kitchen axe and things like this and that. There's all kinds of ways people can get hurt and leave marks on the bones. But particularly injuries to the skull or the cranial region tends to have higher correlation or higher likelihood of actual interpersonal or warfare-based violence. So when I look at I always look at the entire skeleton, which is possible, but this is the most likely place to see evidence that's not just accidental. So seeing things like, for example, evidence of various types of, my apologies, this is when I'm going to be getting to show some pieces of skeletal remains. My apologies for not saying that earlier. I had the drawing first. So the next couple of slides are going to be showing skeletons or pieces of skeletons. So looking, for example, at evidence, these are actually evidence here of violence to the skulls. But the person on top was hit with a what's called a mace head. The person at the bottom was hit with a spear inside the skull itself. You can also see evidence like this. You can really see the kind of concentric circles of the skull here being hit. So this is very clear evidence of violence on the bodies. That's kind of hard to say much else. So those kind of skeletal or cranial evidence is very, very clear. When you talk about things below the skull, it's a little bit harder to interpret because, like I said, there's all kinds of ways you can get hurt. But one of the most likely is for people being hurt by violence, but by other people, what's called perifractures. So if someone were to attack you, you tend to put your arms up like this to kind of protect your body and the top part of your torso. So you do this and someone still attacks you, you'll probably get hit over here in in the upper parts of your arms, what's called a perifracture or protective fracture. So you can see some examples here. You also might get hit in the hands or in the ribs as you're trying to protect yourself in various ways, or injuries to the vertebra. So these are kinds of injuries you might see in conjunction with stuff to the crania that might show indications that you have been attacked by somebody else. This body's been attacked by somebody. Occasionally, but not too often, you're actually even able to match certain types of injuries directly to weapons. You can see an example here where this mark in the skull perfectly matched the size of a spearhead. This is very lucky when we get this done. It shows very clearly that someone was hurt by an actual weapon. So what do I find? So I'm not going to go into too much of the details here for lack of time, really. But what do I find when I looked across all 81 sites and all the evidence of bodies I found is that over my 3 time periods, violence increases on the bodies themselves. What I do see is particularly in the early Bronze Age 2-3 period, adult males in particular often had signs of violence upon their bodies, both things they died by as well as things that they survived. That there were also women and children showed signs of violence upon their bodies, but just in far lower levels than adult males, and that there is very clear signs that this is not just accidental violence in various ways, that there is increasing evidence of people being hurt in violent fashions across these 3 time periods. Moving on then, for example, to weapons. It's a really fascinating study. I love the study of weapons because it really tells us so much about kind of ingenuity and trade and all kinds of things you can do with it. Weapons are made from all kinds of materials such as wood, bone, stone, and metal. One of the difficult aspects of studying weapons in the ancient records, though, of course, is what's a weapon and what's a tool? Because, of course, a lot of things can be both. This is always a bit of a problem for me. It sometimes makes it hard for me to prove some of my points. You can have a dagger. You can have a knife. And of course, a knife can be used to in fighting, but it can also be used to cut your meat. It can be used to whittle down wood. It can be used to, for so many different weapons. Like people can carry around knives all the time with no intention of hurting anybody. It's a tool. The same things with like an axe, for example. We have axes that can be used to fell trees, but they can also be used like a battle axe. And also some things also different between violence and hunting. So you can have a bow and arrow. You can have spears that are used in hunting purposes or also used for warfare. So it's kind of trying to understand how to tell the difference between tools, weapons, and hunting materials. And the way to best do that, I think, is through context. How are things being used? Where are they being buried? How are you finding them? And do the best you can with it. It's not always going to be very clear what's a weapon, what's a tool, what's hunting material. It's more about general trends than anything else. So the major types of weapons that I find in the ancient world are things like sling balls, so little balls either of clay or of stone, used in a sling blade. So it's not sling, sorry, a slingshot. Can be a highly effective weapon. So things like projectile points, which is a fancier way of saying things like arrowheads, mace heads. You can see a picture of that up in the corner here, which is generally actually just a stone on a stick, if I started calling it recently. But it's a very effective weapon, something you would never use as a tool and you would not use as a hunting implement. It's really only useful hitting other people with. So knives, daggers, axes, spears, and swords. These are the kinds of materials I work with and I find in the archaeological record. So this is kind of I have a larger study on this altogether, but again, for lack of time, I'm going to move forward a little bit. But what I do find here is a couple of major things. In the earliest time periods, in the early and middle Chalcolithic, almost all weapons and tools are made from stone, almost entirely. As this time period goes on until the end of the early Bronze Age period, we start to get more and more bronze being found here, which is also important because bronze can only be made through long distance trade. It's quite expensive. People start really having larger and larger amounts of bronze materials, which I find to be really interesting too. There are greater variety and numbers, so people really have all kinds of weapons within cities and within graves, and also they increase quite a lot over periods of time. One thing I found really fascinating with my work here is that earlier on, especially when it comes to metal weapons, they were kept very centrally. So they'd be kept in, say, a armory, and they seem to be owned by the city in some ways, and then be handed out and then put back into there. And by the end of the early Bronze Age period, what I find is weapons are being buried with people. We no longer find the caches. We find instead people seem to be personally owning these weapons and even being buried with those weapons. So this is something I found to be kind of a surprising point. Another point I have, which there is a paper I wrote about it, which I think was linked to this also, is the fact that weapons are found in both male and female graves. And there seems to be indications that women were also being armed with weapons as well. This is a whole other talk and whole other paper in a lot of ways, but my kind of conclusions about that, what I kind of came up with, is the idea then that in this kind of earlier societies, these people do not yet have full-time troops. There are no such thing as professional soldiers. People are farmers or they're potters or anything they are, and they'll fight when necessary. In a place like that, when women are in a lot of danger of being attacked, they'll be more likely to be armed with things like smaller weapons, like daggers, order to protect themselves. So I think while men had a lot higher numbers of weapons in graves, about half of the female graves I found had weapons in them as well, which I thought to be really quite an interesting conclusion I came up with. So moving on then to fortification systems. So we live in an era where we don't really have walled cities any longer. Here in Seattle, there is no city wall. If you're watching this perhaps from an older city, somewhere in Europe or otherwise, then maybe you have the remnants of that. But we no longer have as many city walls as we used to have. But it used to be a major case that any major city, pretty much anywhere in the world, was going to have a large wall around it to protect it from outside people. There's all kinds of reasons why one builds a wall around a stem. It's not just for protection, especially in earlier, you can keeping things like keeping animals in or keeping animals out. So you can keep the wolves out, but you can keep the cattle in. So ideas like that. Also keeping people in and out. So keeping people you don't want in and keeping maybe your smaller people or people you don't want leaving inside this region. It can also be against things like flooding. Sometimes we still do have things like levees or different kinds of walled systems that aren't there for protection against people, but are there for protection against natural disasters like floods. And something you might see quite a lot. Also, just the creation of personal space. If you own a house, you might put a fence around that house or a wall around your backyard. It's not to protect necessarily, to say, this is mine, you can't have it, please stop looking at me from the outside. So this idea then of creation of personal space. And finally, also, yes, of course, protection against violence from outside groups. There's all kinds of reasons to build walls. They are really quite powerful concepts. And also they have a lot of meaning. Walls are highly symbolic. You can think of all the ways that walls can be used and understood because they are a form of protection, but they also take so much work. In order to build a wall around an entire city, often miles altogether, it requires a lot of raw material to make those walls, the manpower necessary to do that, and also the cooperation it takes to build those together. So some form of all the administrative work it takes to create a wall, and not just creating it in the first place, but to make sure all the upkeep is continuous and that that wall is kept strong for years and years to come. So the creation of fortifications is a form of power. It shows that you're able to get that kind of support, that kind of raw material, that kind of coming together of an entire society, as well as it says to the outside people who are coming by the city, this is our city. You can't come in unless we let you do so. There's so many ways. Fortifications are just an incredibly powerful symbol of ownership and of power and of communication within a single society. I find them, again, to be a rather fascinating study. Within Turkey itself, there are just different kinds of fortifications that we find. This one you find quite honestly and quite often is just a single wall built in a circle around it. You know, made of stone or mud brick. It's quite common. Another one you can see in your top right corner here is called a casemate wall. So what you do with a casemate is what you do things, you'll have two walls built parallel to each other with smaller walls occasionally between, making a kind of a ladder-like structure. We can either fill those interior spaces or even you can live in them, you can have storage in them. This creates a much stronger double-walled system called a casemate. The earliest casemate walls we find are from Turkey. We find them all over the world as in later periods as well. Something also called niche and buttress, which you can also see. You have kind of a thicker wall with these kinds of, as it says, niche and buttresses. So kind of these little ins and outs, creating a kind of this pattern that makes it a little stronger than just a simple wall. You also have things like sawtooth. Instead of just having a straight wall on one side, the niche and buttresses on the other, the entire wall zigzags. You can see here. And then one of the more interesting ones you only really find in this period in Anatolia is called the Anatolian settlement plan, where instead of having an outside wall, you have the entire settlement becomes the wall. So what you have is a wall kind of built all around it, but then people build all their houses up against it. So those back walls of every house becomes part of the city wall. So you can see this picture here when all these little settlements and all these buildings are built directly as the wall. So you create a circular settlement with a big open area in the middle that is public space. It's really an interesting way of building your settlement, and you only find this in Anatolia in this time period. Also found those things like ramparts or glacis, which, like I said earlier, are these kind of ramps up to the wall to make it kind of harder to even get there. So these are all the different kinds of walls one finds in ancient Anatolia. So what I found this to be interesting about this, the slide here, is that ultimately in the earliest time periods in the early and middle Chalcolithic, there's basically no to very, very, very few wall systems anywhere in those two regions I discussed. However, by the very end of the early Bronze Age period, every single city has a wall around it. And that's a major change in the course of time. So by the end of this time period, along with this increase of violence and this increase in weapons, there's also all these places now have these gigantic walled systems, which really tells you a lot about how people are building and understanding the need for walls as other signs of increased violence in society. So, iconography should be a very important way of understanding warfare because it often shows exactly how people visualized war and what that looked like to them. So for what you see here on my picture here is what's called the Naram Sin stela. This comes from Mesopotamia, from the Akkadian Empire. What you see here is depiction of King Naram Sin, and he is subjugating and killing his enemies. This is a very important and very famous depiction of early warfare from the very first empire of the world, the Akkadian Empire. So these are obviously iconography is a form of propaganda. It shows what people want people to think about warfare and how a society believes you should see it. And it really matters about where iconography is located. Is it in a giant public space? Is it personal? Is it being kept in homes? Is it being put on the temple walls? So trying to think about the ways iconography is used and understood by society. This is a great idea of how they see and view warfare. Quite unfortunately, when it comes to my study of ancient Anatolia, I don't have much here. They really weren't putting material up there. We'd have almost nothing. When it comes to iconography, there's very, very little that shows there is depictions, there is art, but they don't show a lot of violence in it. So I don't know if I can really draw many conclusions from that. It's also possible there's stuff we just don't have. Maybe there are paintings on walls that just did not preserve. I just can't really say a whole lot. So ultimately, when I look at all this material together, I'm going to go back for a second here. What I find within my case study is all kinds of different evidence of the ways that violence increases throughout time. It goes from this earlier time period when there is some evidence. You do occasionally see bodies with some violence, you find the occasional weapon. And I think there is evidence of like small scale violence here and there. But by the end of the early Bronze Age period, at about 2000 BCE, violence is maybe not endemic, it's not happening constantly, but it's happening in far higher numbers. And not just that, but it's become part of society. So people are doing things like creating weapons and having long distance trades of the raw materials of weapons, in so much that almost every adult male is being buried with it. There's also evidence of every single settlement is being built around the idea of violence, with very strong walls and ways of fortifying and protecting those settlements against the ideas of violence. And finally, there actually is physical evidence, the human skeletal remains of the people themselves with higher amounts of violence upon it. So I can see the ways over this time period across multiple sites that violence is not just at a single place, but is found throughout the landscape at different times, which I find to be just really interesting and a little bit, of course, it's a pretty sober style look at. I want to end this a little bit just talking for just a second here or two about battlefield archaeology. So battlefield archaeology, I think, is what we all would like to see. And I have a picture here of Wounded Knee. This idea then that people go and fight battles on a agreed upon location in some large open space. That's not what we find in the ancient record, actually. The idea of battlefields is something you find as you get empires and bigger concepts. When I look at warfare in this early urban time period, people are not agreeing to fight somewhere. They're fighting within their context of the settlement. So I see there aren't battlefields, there's just settlements. People are being attacked within their own homes. So I see destruction of cities, and I see violence upon women and men, but it's within that kind of context. So there is battlefield archaeology, especially in Europe and North America, but it tends to be more historical based. It could be things different kinds of battles that we know about and we go and find. It actually is quite a lot of even battlefield archaeology of the 20th century, things like World War I and World War II. They weren't from a long time ago, but there's things we even can learn even now through the archaeology of those kinds of materials. So most battlefield archaeology is much more based on historical concepts than prehistoric. There really aren't battlefields from the ancient world. We do have evidence of war, but it's always within the actual context of settlements itself. So there are no known battlefields that I've ever heard of, and I've looked at this quite a bit, but they're only domestic sites. They can be very large. So evidence of site destruction. For example, there's like all kinds of burnt things. This is a place called Alalak, located in the modern village of Talachana in the Antakya region. We do find evidence of that. And there's things like, for example, we can go forward for a second here. There's lots of very famous sites. We have Troy, which is, from the famous story by Homer. We have the site for that. We see the destruction there. Lachish, which is mentioned in the Bible, is a biblical site. And we have the destruction of that. We have Nineveh, Babylon, Persepolis. And so there's all kinds of famous settlements we do have that show evidence of violence. It could be a whole different talk I have about the bigger evidence of violence we have in the archaeological record. Be happy to talk more about these if you like. But I think that is about my time here. So thank you all very much for listening. I'm happy to hear any questions you might have. So I think we have a first question from Todd. So is there a particular time period where you see a large jump in violence? Yes. I really see it in the kind of the transition between what I call uh, early Bronze Age 2 and 3. So just at about um, 23 to 100 to 22 2000 BCE. So before that, there's like different levels, but suddenly, really at that time period, there is like a much higher amount of weapons being found in burials, as well as just like the evidence we have in a couple of cemeteries. The problem with looking at human skeletal remains is I'm not going to find them everywhere. It's kind of a harder part of what I do. But there's a couple of cemeteries, especially a place called Iqui's Tepe, and that particular cemetery has these like really well preserved and hundreds of bodies. You can really see from period where there's like occasional violence to a time period where there really seems to be huge amounts of violence upon the bodies, especially of young men, more than anything else. So I think there seems to be kind of this like outbreak of violence at the very end of the early Bronze Age period. I didn't have to talk about this too much in this. With the very end of the early Bronze Age period, there's a small kind of lull in urbanism when a lot of sites actually are destroyed either through a combination of natural disasters, famine, as well as the possibility of warfare. So some places are abandoned, other places are not. Other places continue right on. There seems to be kind of a breakdown in long distance trade, and things kind of quiet down on the international scale for a little bit. And there seems to be some indication right before that there was a big rash of violence, and then things are kind of quiet again. And then we have to see the emergence of what's called the Middle Bronze Age period, which is actually quite a different cultural time period than the early Bronze. So yeah, which points do you agree with in Keeley's book, or is it just dated terminology? That's a good question. I actually generally agree with quite a lot of Keeley's points. What he actually does, which is a new thing at the time, like there's been a lot more work since what he's done, is he actually takes a combination of ethnographic data as well as archaeological data and looks at the way that violence is present in society. I think before Keeley's book, people either thought that um, non-urbanized societies or early societies, I'm going to use those kind of words like that instead of what Keeley calls them, were either completely peaceful or that their forms of violence were inconsequential. This is coming out of a post-World War I and World War II discussion within anthropology of what war is. People were traumatized by the world wars. And also then you have Vietnam and Korea. So it's all kinds of these gigantic wars that are happening in the 20th century. So all this anthropology is like, well, ancient warfare wasn't warfare. It's just too minor. Let's not even call it warfare. And what Keeley says is it's different, yes. But to say it's not warfare is not entirely fair, because also if you have a society with 1,000 people, and that's a very big size village, say you have war and 2 or 3 men die, that can be incredibly destructive to that village. 3 men of those middle age of like 20 to 30, those are men in the prime of their life. If you take away their work, the fact that they have a wife, they have children, taking away that number, that's a sizable percentage of the population. That these smaller numbers of violence are still astronomically problematic for a society. I think those are the points he makes, is looking at violence not from the point of view of 20th century violence, which is something quite different, but from looking at it from the perspective of the size and scale within smaller groups and how that would have been quite devastating for those populations. So I think those points he makes I find to be really thoughtful and well put together, and using actual data based on what he knew at the time. I think since 1996, there's been a lot of new information about warfare in these earlier time periods. So the stuff that's dated also because just like he was working with what was possible at his time. So beyond just the terminology he uses, like we've come a ways understanding about why he's important. He jump started those conversations. After Keeley's book, people started working with warfare again quite a lot. And he really kind of got that going, which is why I think it's an important book. Are there other questions?
I think that was our last question. If anyone else has any questions, they can throw it in the chat. Oh, Edith Goldman is saying, I suggest that the battles were fought in open space, which would have been mainly agricultural. So I'll let you go ahead.
I mean, it's entirely possible. It's hard to really prove that. Again, because we're talking about a time in which we aren't really looking at textual evidence. I mean, open spaces wouldn't even necessarily be agricultural. I mean, agricultural existed, of course, but there's a lot of open spaces. When I talk about the ways in which when the violence that I do see tends to be within the settlements themselves, because that is what I see. I know that's a bias of what's possible, but there is a lot of evidence of the ways that people were fighting within communities, because we do see that kinds of evidence. We see evidence of burning, we see evidence of destruction. But if people are just, but with most ancient warfare is fought open spaces, sure. I can't speak to that. I have no way of proving or disproving it. I just know a lot of the end results would have been people going after the villages themselves, because that's where the stuff was actually kept. They're fighting for the purposes. I'm not talking about empire. We're pre-empire concept. This is not about conquest. There's no conquering happening here. That takes a long time to get to that point. We're talking about here is people going for materials, or going for things like cattle, going for things like other kinds of animals, going for luxury goods, going for food, and particularly going for women and children. People are not in high numbers, so it would have been more sense to take those kinds of materials. And we do have some iconographic evidence in various places. I didn't have time to show here from other places about the idea of taking away women and children. So, I mean, I think if it started off in open spaces, it would have ended in the village space as well. But this are the problems of archaeology. We can only say what we can say. It's hard to prove ever so many things. We're always missing so much of the information I wish we could have. Any other questions? You can all see my Hittite cup. I like this one. So Marcus, is there anything else?
Right. I think if there are no further questions, we can go ahead and wrap up. I want to thank everyone for contributing and asking thoughtful questions. And I would also like to thank Dr. Sellover for your wonderful discussion. And I would like to remind everyone that today is the 3rd birthday of SASA. And so just want to remind you all that you can become a reoccurring donor with us. And just to remind you guys again, every $25 you donate, you will be entered into a raffle for a chance to win a meet and greet with Dr. Cooney, and you can discuss any of her books. And I will go ahead and wrap up with that. Is there anything else you would like to say before we leave, Dr. Sellover?
Oh, just thank you very much. I was very happy to be part of your event here. So thank you, everybody. Thank you
All
for
right, thank you
listening.
so much for the time.
Thank
All right,
you.
everyone, you guys have a nice day.